Yeah, welcome back and welcome to the new faces. I see that research is now affecting even more authorities here, people than we had in the morning session, which is good. This time our schedule is a little bit tighter than in the morning because we have one more presentation. So I would like to ask the speakers to stick to something like 13 minutes. Again, they get same rule as this morning. We have the yellow and red cards. I will show you the yellow card 2 minutes before the session is ending. In the morning I said that I might even take out the power plug if you're speaking too long. This wasn't necessary in the morning, so hopefully it's not necessary now. Our first presentation is coming from Kira on integration of ecosystem services in marine spatial planning. Kira, the floor is yours. I will take up the presentation. Just take the microphone.
Okay. Thank you, Holger.
There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. This presentation is looking at one aspect that tends to be a little bit neglected in MSP context, which is actually integration of cultural values and cultural ecosystem services. I'll be presenting the results of the ICES WKCES working group, which came together in 2013 to develop a set of recommendations and first ideas for how this incorporation into MSP could be achieved. So the problem context is obvious that MSP is about balancing different issues, different data, different information. We all know that we need to get to know the resource first of all, and then think about risks, and then actually set priorities for MSP or for marine management as a whole. And one gap that commonly does seem to exist is with respect to the intangible values that people associate with the sea. Yesterday, somebody said that it's all about people, and indeed it is. The sea is not just a place for abstract uses or for mapping or for data. It's actually a place that is treasured, is valued, is appreciated for a whole range of different reasons and has many, many different meanings. So the sea is not just a canvas, something that you can draw lines on, but it's very much a personal construct, it's a social construct, and it's a setting for many different economics and, above all, also intangible values. So what are the research needs with respect to these cultural values that people associate with the sea? Well, first of all, there's a need to find ways of codifying them. What are they? What are we actually talking about with respect to cultural values? What are the strengths and weaknesses of concepts such as cultural ecosystem services? Secondly, because we're talking about MSP, it's all about space, so therefore there's a need for identifying places that have particular importance from a cultural point of view. What are the methods that are available for doing that? Thirdly, can we establish any criteria that lead us to a meaningful rating of impacts on these cultural places of importance in the sea? And the fourth aspect, because it is all about making accessible that information, how do we map these places of cultural significance? So these are exactly the question that the ICES working group has asked itself, and I'll be going through the answers that the group came up with respect to all of them. First of all, when we come to talking about cultural values, we need to find a way of describing them a little more precisely. And there, it's important to understand that when we say values, it is actually preference-based values that we're talking about. It's not social norms. And this is really looking at the sea, if you like, as a collection of different goods and benefits. Importantly also, when we talk about cultural values, there are many different ways of talking or classifying values. Here it is very much about place-based values, something that you can actually make tangible, that you can actually maybe even draw a line around. Thirdly, of course, there's no universal classification or definition of what cultural values actually are. And fourth, cultural ecosystem services is just one way of many other ways of actually framing these cultural values. And just to explain what the cultural ecosystem services actually are, here they are. They come from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, as many of you I'm sure will know, and they cover a whole range of so-called intangibles associated with the sea, ranging from aesthetic qualities to beauty of the landscape, heritage values, inspiration, recreation, and so on. So what did we actually in our working group come up with when it comes to identifying places of cultural importance? Well, our brainwave, I suppose, was to actually try to define a concept which we called the concept of culturally significant area. And here the idea was to try and come up with an analogy really to ecology, where there's concepts of ecological significance, to try and actually find ways of putting that on a par with the accepted ecological significance criteria. So an area of, or a culturally significant area would be an area that contains a culturally significant feature, or which is such a feature in its own right. Now, there's a number of aspects to remember in this context. First of all, significance, of course, again, is a very broad, very open term, open to interpretation. In this context, it was defined as a cultural connection a community has to a particular area or place. Now, community, this can be a local community, but it could also be a community of interest. For example, a particular recreational group or a group of tourists who come to visit a place for a particular event or a cultural link that they have to that place. So that leads on to the second very important premise that runs all the way through this proposal, which is that culturally significant areas or cultural significance is not something that can be determined by a scientist in a back room somewhere. It's actually something which has to be identified in a participative process using locally relevant classifications. So the participative process would entail questions such as this. For example, well, first of all, asking, what is it? What is the feature that is so significant here? Where is it? Can it be located precisely in a particular place? Is it there all the time, all the year round, or is it maybe seasonal? Is it maybe only there at certain years? Who actually attaches importance to it? And what qualities are needed to make sure that it survives into the future? So in our group, we tried to make this whole thing a bit more tangible by defining criteria for how we could determine this cultural significance a bit more precisely. And this really took a lot of discussion, and I'm not saying that this is the last words on this by any means. It's a proposal, which I'm very happy to put to you now. So the first criterion, again, similar to the ecological criteria of significance, is uniqueness. There are things that are probably very unique in certain cultures, certainly if you think about indigenous cultures, but also when you think about your own countries, there must be places or traditions that perhaps are quite unique. The second one is called broad cultural reliance, which is really asking how big a portion of that particular community makes use of it. Is it a very important part of community life? Does it play a really significant role for the community at large? Importance of the feature to the resilience of the socio-ecological system, which sounds a bit complicated, but I'll show you in a moment just what that means. There's another one called degree of tradition, and also one which is probably less relevant in European context, but because it's an ICES working group, we also had Canadian participants there, where the indigenous populations are another dimension. Is dramatic cultural change, which really again picks up the idea that some traditions, some cultures may well be under threat from such drastic changes. So let me take you through them in a bit more detail, and don't worry, I'm not going to read all the details. I just want you to focus on the left-hand column because that explains a little bit more what the criteria are trying to do. So uniqueness, as I said, is a pretty obvious one. It's really trying to determine the extent to which the feature or the place or the activity taking place is unique within a certain region, and whether similar features or similar places exist in the same region. And there the idea, of course, is that some features, some places are irreplaceable. They don't exist anywhere else at all. And this could be a sacred site, it could be an archaeological site, it could be something historical, or it could be a particular activity. Broad cultural reliance, I already touched upon this, is really asking, well, how many people or how many groups of people actually use this, rely on this for some essential part of their culture, and how many different functions does this place or this feature fulfill? So it could be an area which is important to many different communities, or the community at large. It could be an area which is important to sustaining other important activities. Or it could be something, an area or a feature, which holds a particular meaning to different groups for many different reasons, and therefore there are many reasons for actually wanting to preserve that particular feature. This one I'm sure you can't really read properly. It is looking at the importance of the feature or the area to the resilience of the community. Now, resilience, again, is a slightly tricky word, but we couldn't think of anything better to describe it. It's really asking how essential is this place or this feature to the integrity of the community? What would happen if that feature or area was lost? If it was degraded in some way, if it was changed in any way, would it have severe repercussions for that community? Would it have severe impacts socially or maybe even economically? Degree of tradition, well, this is really looking at the sort of historic depth of the feature or the area in question. You know, how long has it been valued? Is it one that has been important for hundreds of years, or is it one, doesn't make it any better or worse, is it one that has only recently gained importance, for example, for certain recreational contexts? And the last one, is it actually a unique context of the cultural that actually values the area in question? So that is sort of, you know, the change element. What would happen if this was taken away in the context of broader change that a particular community may be facing? I'm going to run out of time very quickly, so I'm going to have to rush through the rest of it. We also tried to come up with criteria to assess risks posed by developments, let's say, or changes in the environment to these areas of cultural importance. And again, we took the ecological risk criteria as a template. In this case, it was the Canadian ones that served as an example. Essentially, we came up with a scale of 5, trying to define extreme risks, very high risks, high risk, moderate and negligible risks, and found a way of describing what we actually mean by risks to these cultural areas of importance. Some aspects to consider in risk assessment, of course, is that these areas are location specific. It's hard sometimes to draw distinct boundaries around a site that is valued for cultural reasons. There are issues of temporal scale. Features may be valued just during one particular season, in the summer, for example, and not in the winter. And the environmental quality may be impacted by events or by effects that actually take place outside the area itself. So there's that broader environment that also comes into play. And the other aspect, of course, is that relevance or significance is not a uniform thing. It's quite possible that it is restricted to particular social groups, that social groups don't necessarily agree. And that there can also be a danger of non-cooperation if, let's say, the participation, for example, isn't sort of quite ideal, shall we say. Okay, nearly out of time. Mapping these areas is a particular challenge because not all of these lend themselves to mapping. And also, the significance of a service or an area of cultural importance is, of course, not related to the ease with which it can be mapped. So there's a danger that maps may very easily misrepresent the significance or the combined significance of such places. Temporal change, I already alluded to. The interdependency between cultural values on the one hand and other elements of the ecosystem I've also alluded to. And of course, cultural values do exist at different scales. So in mapping, you also need a multi-scale approach. Olga's going to show me the red card any minute. I'm going to skip that. I want to just very quickly tell you that this approach is actually now being tested. It is being tested in the Dart Estuary in Devon in the UK by a research group around Steve Fletcher and Rebecca Shellock. First results are expected very soon. Just to quickly show you that they've in fact gone for a multi-stage process, starting with identifying culturally significant features and areas, looking for baseline information, and then actually applying the IC's working group criteria to these services that have been identified. So the plan is to go all the way around through risk assessment and then to actually evaluate this methodology that has been proposed by the working group. So I'm not going to show you any results as such because they don't yet exist. Just quickly that different methods have been used to try and address these various significance criteria. So you're looking at meetings with historians, for example, semi-structured interviews with members of the local community and online surveys. And just to end with some very interim results, which are not all that surprising, of course. Some of these criteria are harder to assess than others. And you can see that this one here, resilience, is one that is tricky because it is difficult to ask the right questions of people. And there's also the problem that the area under consideration here in the UK is actually quite large. But the people who are being interviewed, of course, only see a very local aspect of this area, not necessarily the whole estuary. So I'll leave it there, actually. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Perfect. Then I would say let's try to make her happy with questions.
Yes, thank you for that introduction to the topic, and I found this very interesting. Sorry, my name is Kai Trümpler. I work for the Federal Maritime and Hydrographic Agency of Germany. In terms of, usually we think, in our agency we think of this in terms of the underwater cultural heritage, and not so much in terms of the broader terms that you have elaborated here. Can you go a bit more into the aspect that you lined out with, for example, indigenous fisheries? Because obviously, apart from just the merely resource management part, you say there's like a cultural part that needs to be protected. So does this go further? That you say, like, for example, these were traditional whale hunting grounds for Inuit, and they have to be protected as in maritime spatial planning? And you know, what's the overlap between the cultural and the resource management part? Yes.
Well, we really came from the point of view of trying to actually define what we mean by cultural connections you can have to particular places in the sea. Now, it's obvious, or it's obvious maybe not, but it's easier to imagine that on mainland and quite hard to imagine that for the sea. So it really comes from trying to identify practices that take place in the sea and particular traditions that go along with them. And yes, the indigenous communities do, of course, have a very different take on that than we in Europe probably have. But there's also fishing communities in Scotland which have a very long particular tradition, or in Ireland, or even in Germany. So the connection, I suppose, on the one hand is to identify these places that are important for those particular activities, but not just because they provide a resource and they provide an income, but also because they provide a cultural connection in some way. So it's not just about the resource or you know, the fish that are harvested from the sea, but it's also about some activities that don't have an economic output at the same time. So I would say with some of these activities, yes, there are obvious links to resource management. With others, they are not quite so obvious in the sense that, first of all, it's about generating awareness that there is actually a value that people are placing on a particular character or a particular place or a particular site, which is in no way marked or is not actually extractive in any way at all. It's just a cultural value. Not sure whether that answers the question, but...
Well, I would like to continue. Andrzej Cieślak, Maritime Office in Gdynia, and co-chair, and so on. So I would like to rather to continue the direction Kai has already taken. So then, in hard, simple words, the planners, of course, will not go into all these very complicated deliberations, but they need simple indications, place and terms of restrictions or allowances which are allowed in this place and in that time. Could you indicate what kind of things would answer this requirement?
Well, the disclaimer, of course, is that this is very early stages. But the idea of the work that was done in the working group was to actually provide a pretty simple methodology and to make it as analogous as possible to the ecological significance assessment that can take place, which is why we've tried to come up with these criteria that can actually be measured. And yes, it'll require time to actually go through these. Yes, it'll require effort because it takes participatory approaches. But at the end of it, what you will hopefully end up with is, in fact, a kind of a map or some way of actually being able to say, this is a place that is important for cultural reasons, and these are the threats that it may be subjected to, or let's say, or rather, these are acceptable risks and these are unacceptable risks because, well, let's say certain developments such as a big wind farm, for example, might detract from the very essence of a particular place in such a way that it would lose its value. So it's trying to sort of find a way of actually pointing to what can actually take place within an MSP context, and what sort of development would be appropriate, and what sort of development perhaps wouldn't be appropriate in such a place of high cultural significance.
Okay, we have two more questions, and then unfortunately we need to go a step further.
Okay. Ivona Pomian, Underwater Cultural Heritage Group on the Baltic. First, I would like to thank you for this presentation because it was a great explanation of what I tried to tell yesterday, why it's not only tourism but also other values of the cultural heritage. And to answer a little bit to you, we both of us, we are with the same region, so we have occasion to discuss this problem for many years. And I remember when we started to cooperate, it was a problem even to discuss protection for very known and valuable wrecks. So it changed a lot that we start to talk about so delicate matter of culture, like, for example, non-material culture, what you taught. So it's important to define it. And then we will be able to give a more precise information. Thank you.
Briefly on this, or?
Thank you. Just a brief follow-up on the example of the salmon fisheries that you have given. How do you, obviously that requires a little more holistic approach than maybe even MSP can give you, right? Because you need to make sure that the catchment quotas are, even way outside MSP jurisdiction are being, kept, and also far inland you have to make sure that the spawning grounds are protected, otherwise there'll be no salmon fishery. How do you imagine the process to cover all these aspects?
You're absolutely right, and I don't think MSP is the answer to all of these questions, of course, and that applies to many other ecological goods, of course, that we take from the sea. It takes a holistic approach to management, and MSP is one part of it. The purpose, however, was is very much to raise awareness and to actually bring these values to the light, if you like, very much, because if you don't know about it, then it's very hard to plan for it or to take it into account in planning. And it's also important, I think, to realise it's not just ever going to be about the cultural values. It's always going to be a mix of different things. So yes, some communities might attach great importance to something, but the same place might also be important for economic reasons or for ecological reasons. So it's probably not an exclusive thing that we're going to find here. And that means also that different tools are going to be needed to sort of try and address all that in combination. And just like with any other sort of an important habitat, for example, it's not just going to be down to MSP to resolve all the issues for that and to make sure biodiversity is conserved. It's going to have to be a concerted effort of many different tools coming together at different scales. But the important point is to actually be aware that it's there.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Kira. Obviously, a topic that we touched here, which could bring us to other discussions.